Alright, this is the third little video and much shorter than the other two. It's a final case study building on Mill's views on censorship. I've called this Mr. Oil Dealer Harm and Instigation. Mr. Oil Dealer, here's the case, has raised prices and is causing massive rise in inflation that has driven entire regions into poverty. The press has been very vocal denouncing this activity, and finally an angry mob gathers around the oil headquarters. There, Mr. Liberty grabs a megaphone and simply reads out the headlines of 10 major newspapers regarding inflation and oil prices. The crowd goes wild, storms the oil headquarters, and burns them to the ground. In court, Mr. Oil Dealer sues Mr. Liberty for damages. Mr. Liberty takes a triple defense. A, that the damage inflicted on the oil headquarters is a necessary harm, no different than the economic damage of a strike, to force Mr. Oil Dealer to reconsider how much more his behavior is harmful to the others. B, if the court charges Mr. Liberty for damages, all the newspapers are equally liable. C, hereafter, newspapers may no longer publish negative opinions. So in this case study, which is obviously inspired by Mill's corn dealer story, it brings out a series of issues. The first is the alleged difference between opinion and action that Mr. Oil Dealer and Mill espouse. The point is that whereas newspapers simply expressed opinions that had no effect of damaging anyone, and therefore didn't incur in the harm principle, the expression of Mr. Liberty in the context of the mob amounted to action that produced damaging effects, and therefore could have been subject to censorship on the basis of the harm principle. Now, the assumption is that there can be opinions that have no effect on actions on others, and others that may have effect on actions in a harmful way. So in other words, there are some opinions, you can have them, there's not going to be any action, so they're not harmful. Other opinions, you express them, they will generate actions that are harmful, and therefore they should be censored. Now, this is evidently shifty, for if it is true, censorship can only be applied in the aftermath of actions. So you have to wait to see if what you said has caused damage and harm, and then you can censor it. What if, for example, an angry mob had rushed to the oil headquarters immediately after a newspaper had been published with a particularly mean headline? Would that have amounted to instigation? Or what if Mr. Liberty's speech had not set off storming of the oil headquarters? Would the same speech act been legitimate only because no violent actions had followed? So there must be an intrinsic requirement on free speech, whereas legitimacy cannot depend on reactions of third parties. Otherwise, in the Charlie are we Charlie debate, one could say, well, this particular free speech has generated harm and violence, and therefore censorship should be applied. But that can only be applied after having seen the harm. There is certainly a limitation to this argument. The remoteness of the instigation must also be considered. Mr. Liberty's point on the liability of newspapers illustrates the argument. Why should Mr. Liberty be condemned as the only instigator when the newspapers had created unrest and prepared the fire for the final spark? Mr. Liberty is consequently also correct in asking that if declared guilty, newspapers should no longer publish negative opinion that may amount to instigation of damage. So as we can see, Mill's introduction of censorship because of instigation and the arbitrary distinction between opinions that influence actions and opinions that don't influence actions create much room for subjectiveness and arbitrariness that Mill is actually trying to avoid. And a final point emerges concerning Mr. Liberty's first offense. He's stating that the harm done to the oil company is in effect no harm at all, but a necessary means to avoid a greater harm. You say, we're just burning down the factory, but that's going to avoid, or the headquarters, that's going to avoid greater harm to more people through the evil acts of Mr. Oil. If overall well-being is the ultimate value, as Mill would defend, it can be argued that the general population will be better off with lower inflation. And therefore, any action, even violent, that contributes to this is legitimate on the basis of Mill's reasoning. One problem here is that it's obviously very difficult to predict the consequences, for they may just as well not contribute to well-being. The burning of the oil headquarters may actually set off a set of chain reactions against other multinational companies, resulting in widespread social unrest and consequent recession. So you don't really know how that's going to go. And again, utilitarianism faces too many unpredictable factors to ensure the easy calculation of benefits and harm. So this case study can be summarized by the 4 types of controversy over the harm principle. 1, should greater harms be avoided by overriding free expression? 2, is the harm severe enough to limit free expression? In other words, is it cost effective? 3, does expression really cause harm? 4, is the harm really harm? So when censorship is justified by instigation of potential harm, too much remains, unfortunately, unsolved. The only speech that risks harming anyone is to no one is no speech at all. And Mill may have done well to do further work on exactly how the harm principle is regulated, for an awful lot remains unsolved. Having said that, I hope this brief illustration of some of Mill's thinking adds to the debate, to the great debate I hope you're enjoying tonight. Thank you.